written before the Beatles, is generally regarded as an era in which most British artists were just bland imitations of American acts from that era. But of course, there were a few exceptions. And Screaming Lord Sutch was one of them. Sutch is widely considered to be one of the pioneers of shock rock. His stage performances and wild shows were a huge influence on artists such as Alice Cooper or Arthur Brown, among many others. And his version of Jack the Ripper has become a classic from that era. Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages also featured many musicians who became big names later in the 60s and the 70s. Musicians like Jimmy Page, Ritchie Blackmore, Jeff Beck, Nicky Hopkins, Keith Moon, and Matthew Fisher were all members of the Savages at one point or another. Let's take a look at the history of the band and explore some of the singles they released.
In the middle of the night, I get out of my great big long black coffin till the fall of night.
Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages released their first single in December 1961. The band had already caused quite a sensation in London, and their live shows at the Two Eyes Coffee Bar had already become legendary. Lord Sutch and his 18-inch long hair also caused quite a shock among audiences. Genius British producer Joe Meek caught the band live in London and immediately decided to sign him to a 5-year contract. The A-side of the single was an excellent rocker penned by Sutch himself. The song featured an unusually long intro which lasted close to 50 seconds. The intro highlighted Joe Meek's knack for weird effects and studio experimentation. The B-side was a cover of Good Golly Miss Molly. This truly frantic cover of the Little Richard classic explains why so many punk rock bands from the late 70s cited Sutch as an influence. The wild rock and roll displayed on both sides of the single was quite different from most British 45s released at the time.
With an Outlaws B-side called Shake With Me.
Future Deep Purple member Ritchie Blackmore joined the Savages in early 1962 shortly after the release of their first single. In an interview from the early 80s, Blackmore recalled,
"The Savages actually kicked me out because I wasn't quite good enough. They'd had some really brilliant lead guitarists. One, I think, was Bernie Watson. So Joe Meek heard about this and said, oh, how about joining my band, the Outlaws? So I said, okay, sounds good to me. I mean, the Outlaws were more well-known than the Savages, so I was quite pleased."
The Savages didn't release a new single until March 1963 due to several lineup changes and problems within the band. Some members of the Savages, such as drummer Carlo Little and pianist Nicky Hopkins, were also playing with Cyril Davies.
I got my mojo working, but it just won't work on me.
And Carlo Little even left the Savages in 1962 to join an early incarnation of the Rolling Stones. In an interview from 1998, Carlo Little recalled,
"Well, I first met the Rolling Stones when they were a semi-professional group in London. They used to come and see the band I was with, called the Cyril Davies Blues Band, and they liked what they saw and heard and asked me to do a few gigs because they didn't have a drummer. So I went along with them, done a few gigs with them, and they asked me to stay, but you know, there wasn't any money. They were just a semi-pro group, nobody had heard of them. And I said, well, I can't stay, I think I'll have to go back to the band I was with before, and which was Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. And I said, why don't you try Charlie? Everybody knew Charlie because he used to be around on the scene, sitting in with different bands around the London club scene. I said, why don't you try Charlie? And well, the rest is history. Yes, I was invited to go and see him in the Paris stadium, the Stade or something, where they did the World Cup, massive great new stadium.
So tell us what happened with the lads, Carlo.
Turned round and saw me at the door and they went, Carlo! I said, it's been a little while, lad, hasn't it? 35, he said, man, he said, oh, so pleased you've come. I said, Keith, what are you doing later? Fancy a drink? Fancy a drink? You're coming back to the hotel, it's Mick's birthday, and there's a great big party. Okay, come on, let's have a sit down, let's have a chat. Want a drink? Get them drinks, some photos, arms around each other. And the more it went on, the more exciting it got. I really couldn't believe it was all happening. It was like a dream. It was rock and roll in the 60s, and we're all still rocking in the 90s. Yeah.
previously stated, Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages didn't release a new single until March 1963. But this became their most popular 45.
When she walks down the street, he's never far behind.
Undoubtedly, Jack the Ripper is the song for which Sutch will forever be remembered. The song featured Carlo Little on drums, Bernie Watson on guitar, Rick Brown on bass, and Nicky Hopkins on piano. Jack the Ripper became a jukebox hit, but it wasn't a chart success when it was originally released. The song, however, caused quite a stir and it was banned by the BBC for being in bad taste. The band was also forbidden to perform the song in several ballrooms across the UK. But Jack the Ripper became a classic, and one of the highlights of their live shows.
What have I done? What have I done? Have I? Circumcised him. But I don't care!
The single gave Screaming Lord Sutch a lot of publicity, and Decca Records decided to release a new single in September 1963. The A-side was an excellent cover of I'm a Hog for You.
I can't get enough of your love. When I go to sleep at night, that's the only thing I dream of.
And the B-side was Monster in Black Tights.
My monster in black tights. You got the kind of eye that I likes. With a wrinkled
The song was a parody of Venus in Blue Jeans by Jimmy Clanton, and it was written by Jeff Goddard and Joe Meek. Both sides became staples of the Savages shows, but the single failed to chart. Despite their lack of chart success, their popularity as a live band was unstoppable. The group was famous for appearing on stage dressed as cavemen, an idea that they had nicked from British rocker Wee Willie Harris.
I go ape every time I see you smile.
Their following single was released in July 1964. She's Fallen in Love with the Monster Man was another shot of Lord Sutch madness, with a little Joe Meek insanity on the side.
We were just making love, kind of kidding around, when the monster appeared with this crazy sound.
The song was a sort of rereading of Monster Mash, with some of the trashiest sounding girl vocals ever recorded. And it also featured some great fuzz guitar by Jimmy Page. The B-side was a cover of Bye Bye Baby by Johnny Otis. Apart from his music career, Sutch also got into politics, and he founded the National Teenage Party in late 1963.
Screaming Lord Sutch demands that he to Parliament be sent forthwith to speak for pop, teenage and coffee bars. Alas, Lord Sutch, squares here or cats prevail. Lost, most irreclaimably all gone, is thy deposit down election's drain.
What do you think of Screaming Lord Sutch, the entertainer?
What, the one who tried to put up as an MP?
Yes.
Very little.
You don't think much of him?
No, very little.
What do you think of his records?
I've heard some of those. They're far better than his spoken word and his mentality would suggest, I think.
The party changed its name to the official Raving Loony Monster Party in 1983.
People like you're ruining this country, you!
Screaming Lord Sutch holds the record for contesting the most parliamentary elections. Sutch contested 39 elections between 1963 and 1997. He never came close to winning an election. But ironically enough, some of the policies he advocated in the 60s were later adopted by the mainstream parties. In 1964, Sutch also founded his own pirate radio station. Radio Sutch, intended to compete with other pirate stations such as Radio Caroline, and also get some publicity in the process. Sutch soon tired of the station and sold it to his manager Reginald Calvert, who changed its name to Radio City.
This is Radio City on 197 meters medium wave. This is the station that was created by Screaming Lord Sutch. It's time now to introduce our record of the week, which is the Fabulous Fortune singing Look Homeward, Angel.
Later in 1966, Calvert was shot dead in a dispute over pirate stations, and Radio City was shut down in 1967. Sutch spent most of 1964 struggling to find a stable lineup of musicians. The Tridents, a band which featured Jeff Beck on guitar, backed him on several dates. And some sources claim that Beck played on his following single.
But I can't resist that passionate kiss I'm in love with Dracula's daughter.
Dracula's Daughter was released in October 1964, and despite all the attention that Sutch was getting with his political party and his radio station, the single once again failed to reach the charts. The Melody Maker wrote,
Dracula's Daughter is the usual monstrous saga that defies human description. Musically, it's nowhere, but in horror appeal, it has a certain ghastly attraction.
Despite several sources claiming that Jeff Beck played guitar on the track, other sources claim it was Jimmy Page. This video footage of Sutch and the Savages recording the song at Joe Meek's studio is priceless.
Sorry, no. Is that the level you want to give?
Yes.
Well, yeah. Oh, fair enough. Right. It's a bit over the top. Okay.
Well,
went a bit weird that time.
Yeah, well, shall I call it a bit?
No, just like that.
Okay. Right, fair enough. Right.
Come by.
Love me. Lips are blue, eyes are red. I laugh like gurgling water.
The B-side of the single was Come Back Baby. The song featured probably the nastiest fuzz guitar of 1964. With the arrival of 1965, Sutch planned to change the sound of the band and go for a more R&B oriented style. Sutch hired 4 saxophone players, and Ritchie Blackmore joined the band again. Blackmore played on their following single, a cover of Train Kept A Rolling.
The train kept a rolling. Yes, the train kept a moving.
The single was released in May 1965, and undoubtedly, the highlight of the song was Blackmore's killer guitar solo, which sounded quite ahead of its time. The B-side was Honey Huck. The song featured another excellent fuzzed-out solo by Ritchie Blackmore. This became the last Sutch single with Joe Meek as a producer. His following single was produced by Irving Martin, and it was one of the weirdest 45s he ever released.
The days are lonely, can't sleep or eat.
The Cheek was issued in May 1966. The single is one of the earliest examples of British psychedelia ever released. It would be easy to assume that Sutch saw that times were changing and decided to jump on the psychedelic bandwagon. But in May 1966, psychedelia was still several months away from becoming a trend. Just to put things into context, this single was released over 3 months before Revolver by the Beatles, and just a couple of months after Shapes of Things by the Yardbirds and 8 Miles High by the Byrds, which are widely considered to be the first psychedelic singles ever released. Its release in May 1966 also coincided with the release of the Stones' Paint It Black, another early example of British psychedelia. The fans who preferred his early style didn't have to worry. The B-side was a great horror rocker called Black and Hairy.
With mud and worms hanging from his back, he outstretched his arms and his bones give a crack.
This single was the last record that Sutch released in the UK until 1970. Lord Sutch spent the rest of the 60s touring the UK and Europe and keeping himself busy with the National Teenage Party. In 1967, the band briefly changed its name to Lord Caesar Sutch and the Roman Empire. At that point, the band still featured Ritchie Blackmore on guitar. And it also featured Procol Harum's organist Matthew Fisher. Fisher had already recorded A Whiter Shade of Pale during his spell with Sutch. But he stayed with the group for financial security until the record took off. The band also released a new single that was only issued in Germany and Sweden. The band toured Scandinavia extensively, and by the time the tour came to an end, the song reached the charts in Sweden. The B-side was a number penned by Sutch called You Don't Care.
Well, you're only 17 and you don't know what to do. Yes,
Screaming Lord Sutch returned to the recording scene in 1970 with an album called Lord Sutch and Heavy Friends. The album featured many big names who played with him in the early to mid-60s. Several songs featured Jimmy Page on guitar and John Bonham on drums. The songs with Page and Bonham were recorded in May 1969 at Mystic Studios in Los Angeles. Sutch then flew to the UK and recorded the rest of the tracks at Olympic Studios with guests such as Jeff Beck, Nicky Hopkins, and Hendrix's bassist Noel Redding. Most of the guests who performed on the record disowned the project after it was released. They felt the songs sounded like a bunch of demos and were not satisfied with the result. The album got terrible reviews in the press, and in a BBC poll from 1998, the record was named as the worst album of all time. It has also appeared on several other lists of worst albums ever released. But I beg to differ. The album is certainly not a masterpiece, and Sutch's vocals leave much to be desired, but it's a fun rock record with cool contributions from some of the best musicians from that era.
Well, he walks up to them with his hands outstretched. I'm looking for Alice Cooper.
In 1972, Sutch played at the London Rock and Roll Show, a major concert held at Wembley Stadium. He was on the bill with several rock giants such as Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Chuck Berry. Sutch appeared on stage with green hair, and he actually managed to get more press attention than the rest of the artists, not only because of his stage antics, but also because he hired a couple of strippers to do some topless dancing on stage. Yeah! 1972 also saw him releasing another record very much in the style of his previous LP. The record also featured several big names who had played with him in the 60s such as Ritchie Blackmore, Matthew Fisher, and Keith Moon. Keith Moon had played with the Savages during the summer of 1962. The reason why he got the gig was because Savages drummer Carlo Little was his drum teacher, so Carlo advised the Savages to hire him as a drummer while he was busy playing with Cyril Davies. Sutch spent the rest of his career mostly touring and attending his commitments with the official Monster Raving Loony Party. Several record labels issued compilations featuring his singles from the 60s, and Sutch released the odd record every once in a while, but releasing new music no longer seemed to be among his priorities. Despite his constant touring, one thing that his bandmates and friends didn't know was that Sutch had been struggling with depression for several years. In 1999, at the age of 57, Sutch took his own life. His wife remembered.
It seemed to come in waves, so he'd have good weeks, good days, interspersed with bad weeks and bad days. He never really got over his mother's death. It had hit him very hard. I went in the afternoon and I opened the door. I had a key, I opened the door. And I could see him at the top of the stairs. And it looked as though, at first I didn't realise what he was doing, and it looked as though he was standing at the top of the stairs, and it looked almost as though he had makeup on because he was so pale. I said, David, what are you doing? And he didn't answer. And it was only as I got, to the end of them that I could see that he was dead, that he was hanging.
Good night, wherever you are. An evil Christmas to you all.